tenim aquesta sessió avui, aquest matí.
Good morning, everyone. This morning we will be devoting our first session to our keynote panel, and then a panel to talk about the challenges and the great lines at the industrial policy level in Europe, as well as technological.
Opportunity to learn firsthand how the European Union is shaping the future in terms of industrial and tech policies. I would like you to introduce to Wen Kozigu. He's the Director, DG Grow at the European Commission, and he will be explaining about industrial policy and resilience. Thank you, Wen, for being here. And after the presentation, we will have some time to chat, and we will open the mic to the audience. So, Wen, thanks again. The floor is yours for whenever you want to start.
Thank you very much, Ma. Good morning, everybody. Pleased to be with you today, and pleased to talk about the subject I've been working upon. I don't hesitate admitting for how long. I think 32 out of 39 years I've now spent in the European Commission industrial policy. So perhaps before we start on what we're doing today, let's go back a few years' time, a bit more than 2 years' time. We felt that we'd been doing industrial policy. Not always, by the way. Sometimes we had to hide doing industrial policy in the European Commission, because if you go back to the 1980s, where you were not born, but I was, unfortunately, industry was a suspicious word. There was something of the past. Services were the new thing. You know, everybody should become a trader. And industrial policy was even worse, because at European level, remember, Maggie Thatcher was one of the leaders. Industrial policy was almost a bad word. And even in Germany, industrial policy, despite the fact that we were doing industrial policy, was very much connotated as a concept, as a French Gaullist concept, Concorde, Minitel, all these things that actually look good but don't sell at the end. So that was the context, services being the thing of the future. And things have evolved progressively until 2008, when we had the financial crisis, and where we realized that member states basically that recovered the fastest were those who still had a strong industrial base. Germany, Finland, for example, Sweden. So industry was progressively coming back to the scene. And 2.5 years ago, back in March 2020, we thought it was important to develop a more strategical thinking about. We were, of course, active in the meantime, but also to adapt. And we developed a new industrial policy. It was motivated first by the need we had to make the European industry fit for the ambitions we have, and of which we hope they will be the realities of the future, basically the twin transition, the green transition on one hand and the digital transition on the other, because they are our priorities. I mean, you might have noticed that the recovery plan that we issued, the 750 billion post-COVID, actually is very much oriented, because there's a condition on member states to have a minimum percentage of 37% on greening and 20% on digital. Actually, I saw the figures of Spain, and Spain is roughly 40% about greening, and is also above our digital target. So basically, you're doing very well from that perspective. The second reason why we felt the need to adapt our industrial policy was because we had observed that we wanted already more resilience, and I'll come back to that. Some people call it strategic autonomy. Some people who are call it open strategic autonomy. So we use the word resilience. That way, those two trends can live with it. We also wanted to continue ensuring open markets, to start with the European internal market, but of course on a wider basis. And we wanted also to stress the importance to innovate and support innovation if we want to remain one of the leaders in the global competition. This approach, this strategy of 2020 is still valid, but I must say it was adopted beginning of March 2020. In the month of March 2020, something occurred, you might have noticed. And actually, one of the first things with the pandemic that bursted out, one of the first things that everybody observed was the fact that we were lacking masks, we were lacking goggles, we were lacking gowns, we were lacking gloves, and that was actually I would say, perfect illustration of what we were saying, that we had to increase our resilience and to make sure that we would have the goods we need. So after having fought and looked for the masks everywhere and struggled during that year in order to get the economy more or less working as much as it could work, and the sanitary situation improved, we decided 2021 to update this strategy, still keeping the 2020 as a basis, but to update it and to actually recall our three objectives, the twin transitions, so the green, the digital, but now resilience had become very prominent as well. And on the basis of what we observed as well, we wanted to stress the importance of the European internal market, because one of the first things we observed is that the natural reaction by member states when COVID arrived was to close their borders. To close their borders on personal protection equipment, but also, generally speaking, to close the border to the point where we had actually to negotiate with them the opening of corridors at the borders for essential goods. Because there we could convince them that basically personal protection equipment like masks and so on are essential goods, or everything, respirators and so on, but also food. And once we had done that, then everybody realized that if you want to transport food from one place, from member state A to member state B, it's difficult to do it with that paperboard or with that plastic. So then we could open to a wider scope than essential, because essential was the convincing element, but the essential goods need what you could describe as non-essential goods if you want to sell them. And in this updated strategy, we also developed a new concept. We had worked for years on the basis of sectors, so horizontal policy completed by sectorial policy, which we had already made evolving the concept of sectors to the concept of value chains, because if you're in a given industry, a given sector, you need the other sectors as suppliers or as customers and so on. But this concept of value chain is valid, but is also a bit incomplete, because what you observe is that basically we work along ecosystems. We need research, we need academia, we need the services that go as well with the given value chain, industrial value chain. So we introduced this ecosystem. And for the sake of facility, we identified 14 ecosystems and a few transversal things. Among the examples of the transversal elements, raw materials, because you need raw materials in all ecosystems, and you need machinery in all ecosystems as well. So basically, there are things that I would describe as horizontal. So coming back to the COVID crisis, we basically it actually put the focus on our weaknesses and the important risks that we were running in the EU. For example, the dependency on key products, but also on certain strategic technologies when we made the analysis. These risks existed for a long time already. I remember being in charge of raw materials when the rare earth crisis occurred. That was actually the problem, because we were sourcing rare earth 97%, I think, from China only. So the day the Chinese decided that for environmental reasons they would not export rare earth anymore, which is quite strange because they were still selling rare earth for the Chinese market, so which had obviously no environmental consequence, only exported rare earth were damaging for nature. That was a shock to some of our industries. I open a bracket there. We went to the WTO. We made a case there together with Japan and the US. We won the case 2 years later. But in the meantime, the first processing stage had moved to China. So we won legally, and we lost economically. So that's the lesson of WTO, and that's why WTO, among other things, need to be reformed. I'm not saying that Mr. Trump is right on everything, but on this element that the WTO needs reform, he was not wrong. So there are exceptions in life, you know. Life is full of exceptions. And as I mentioned, we had difficulties getting the personal protection equipment. And since then, since the recovery post-COVID, we've also been impacted by shortages. Semiconductors is one which is well known, so in the electronic domain. But as far as mobility is concerned as well, we've got difficulties because semiconductors are also not only used in ICT, but they're also used for cars. Then there was that shortage. Actually, it was not political. It was basically the fact that most of the semiconductors were built in Taiwan. And so there's no political issue with Taiwan. But the fact is that the demand was so big that the company there had to decide which part of the market to serve. And it just happens that semiconductors used in the IT for computers and so on are actually more performing than those needed in the car industry. And economically speaking, the companies went for what they could add value more and sell more expensive. So basically, the capacity, production capacity they had, they tried to use as much as possible for IT and less for cars. We have also had problems for renewables, for certain materials used for renewables, renewable energy, or for construction. I mean, construction still experiences shortages. So that's COVID and post-COVID, and since February, by the way, 24th of February, I'm not going to forget that one because it's the date of my birthday. 24th of February, we've got the Russian aggression against Ukraine. And there as well, the dependency of the EU and its geopolitical consequences have appeared very clearly to all of us, especially in the area of energy and in the area of raw materials. So these strategic dependencies are being analyzed now as a real potential danger, if not a real danger or a real risk, for our economic security, but also for our societal security, because you can imagine all the democratic consequences that can derive from such a situation. It's fair to say that Europe has had difficulties to adapt to these shocks. We still have, by the way, be it on the supply side, but as well on the demand side, how to adapt the demand so that we go for what is available. And this has got a real impact on our economy. So we found that it was extremely important, it's still extremely important to better understand where these strategic dependencies are, and then to take the necessary measures in order to deal with them, and measures that have to be adapted to our various industrial ecosystems. So that's what that's what we've started to do with our updated industrial strategy in 2021, because it presents the vision that is ours. Excuse me, but the air conditioning and the flights, and so I don't have COVID. So our vision is about how we can go approach these dependencies. The first thing I'd like to stress is that we keep convinced that open markets are good, because you've the automatic reaction, which is let's close the borders. By the way, there's no country in the world that can avail everything on its own territory. Even the US or even China, they don't have everything at home. They need to buy. So, for Europe, it's even more true that if we were to go to autarky, we would not be able to satisfy our needs. So the priority is therefore to work with our international partners so that we can reinforce our supply chains, but also, and then if possible with reliable international partners, but also, and perhaps even more importantly, to diversify what we have not sufficiently done in the past, to diversify the sources of our imports, so that we do not depend on certain countries whenever possible. And I'm not only talking about countries that could present, if you want, a geopolitical risk. I will mention rare earth and some other raw materials, but if you think of cobalt, it's Congo. So that's another type of risk. And this being said, and despite the fact that we remain attached to open markets and we want to diversify them, and I'll come to the instruments later on, it's also important to understand that open markets are not the alpha and the omega. They're not the solution to everything. And in certain cases, we have to establish and develop our strategic capacity in Europe, especially where the diversification possibilities are limited, or when a sector or a given sector is particularly strategic, and we cannot afford not to avail its knowledge and the necessary capacities. So we have analyzed our strategic dependencies, if you want, and we intend to continue doing it. And one first striking thing is that not all dependencies are strategic. There are dependencies that you can live with, and there are certain others you cannot live with. So it's important to differentiate, and so that we can focus on where really it's important, where it makes a difference, where these dependencies present the biggest risks for our economy and our society. And I'll give you the flavor of what we have as in terms of our priorities, and you won't be surprised. I'll start with the digital sovereignty. Digital is one of the two elements of the twin transition. And even for greening, what people tend to forget sometimes, even for greening, you need digitalization. So they are not two different things. There are also, there's also interconnections. And there we need, as far as digital is concerned, that we have the essential infrastructure. And unfortunately, we are still very dependent on third country companies for certain technologies and for certain critical goods and services that are digital. I'll give you two examples. I mentioned semiconductors. We depend heavily on the production of a few companies in Asia, especially for the best performing semiconductors. But it's the same for the cloud, for example, where the biggest European operator represents 2% of the European market. So it's basically Americans that are offering that service. The second avenue are the green technologies. There the situation is a bit mixed. But if we want to succeed with transition, we need to have a guaranteed access to these technologies. And on top of that, we would like to be the global leader on that, because we are actually the ones who are leading on the transition climate, despite the fact that it might not be perfect, but we are ahead of the others. We are strong in this sector, but we also have weaknesses. To give you examples, we are leader on wind, and we have a positive trade balance in that domain for the last 20 years. We also have got important capacities as far as clean hydrogen is concerned. We have roughly half of the electrolyzers manufacturers in the world, including with big electrolyzers. But we need to invest heavily so that for hydrogen, which will be an essential technology, we keep our position as a leader. Batteries, there the situation was a bit different, but we are catching up. Actually, I was in charge of the automotive sector when we launched the European Batteries Alliance. I'll come back to that one. And we need massive investments if we want to catch up on that. They are starting. We've got more than 2 billion that are already been mobilized, and it's both public and private investment. But we are weak on solar. Solar energy, we're extremely weak. We depend almost entirely on China. Third domain, I mentioned rapidly, but it's the critical raw materials. We will only be able to develop technologies on the basis if we have access to raw materials, in particular to the critical raw materials. I mentioned the rare earth, but there are also other ones, and they're used in most industrial ecosystems. And coming to rare earth, whereas China manufactures 97% of the commercialized rare earth in the world, rare earth are essential for permanent magnets. And permanent magnets, guess what, are essential for wind turbines. So it's a sort of catch-22 situation where we basically, and there, I mean, strategically speaking, you've got two ways. Either you find other sources of rare earth, or you develop a technology, basically you substitute, and you have permanent magnets that do not need rare earth to function, which means that you have to finance research there as well. You have to do both. China is also very dominating the production of magnesium. We don't produce nothing in terms of magnesium. That's also a raw material which is very important. And there are, and on top of that, what we observe is not only that China exploits its raw materials at home, but they have a very strong strategy to buy mines in Africa. So you can see that in terms of security of supply, we have to be alert and we have to act. Fourth avenue, defense and space. It's also a subject which is very important, and I mean, the present situation shows it. There is less a question of supply, it's a question of fragmentation of the market and of not enough investment until now. So not only have we not invested enough, but we've invested in each member state in a completely different manner. I can give you the example. We've got 3 fighters that are European. We've got the Gripen, which is Swedish-British. You've got the Eurofighter. You've got UK, again, Germany, Italy, Spain, I think, as well. And you've got the Rafale, which is Franco-French. But given the price of development of such weapons, it's clear we will never have the financial means to have, again, 3 programs for the next generation. So either we succeed in having one, or we buy American. And that's as simple as that. I don't go into tanks, because it's even worse. I think I don't remember how many programs we've got for terrestrial equipment, rolling equipment. I think it's 32 in Europe. So, I mean, so there we need to look at really the weaknesses and to introduce rationalism and efficiency. Now, I've been listing a lot of problems, so we'll try to see whether we've got some means to improve the situation. because at the end of the day, it's not, otherwise we sit down and we cry together, and I don't think that's securing your future. The first thing is to make a proper analysis. Before you start handling whatever problem, you have to understand the situation. Otherwise, you fix something which is beside the point. And that's why we've decided to develop strong analysis on a permanent basis of our dependencies. We need to understand better where they are, what are they, and what nature they have. We've now launched this complete evaluation of strategic dependencies and strategic capacities of the EU. The first series of examination of deeper formulation was presented in May last year, and actually we targeted 6 strategic domains: raw materials, batteries. I don't know how you call that, the active pharmaceutical ingredients. So basically, that's also something we noticed with COVID, when we discovered that we don't produce aspirin in Europe or paracetamol, that we're depending on India, and that we even paracetamol, we had difficulties of supplying. Not talking only about COVID-related issues. Hydrogen, semiconductors, and cloud and its periphery. So those were the first 6, and we continue now on other elements so that we have a second series that was published 2 months ago or 3 months ago. Magnesium, photovoltaic panels, chemical products, as well as for certain technologies, cyber. And now you see why we cannot depend on others in cyber only. Otherwise, we'll all have our cybersecurity ensured by Huawei. Okay, that's a choice. Or software as well that is linked with the cloud. Now, once you've got the better understanding of where we are, what type of solutions do we have? The first one, I mentioned it already, is to work with our international partners and to diversify sourcing. That's the reason why we've established partnerships with Canada, and we had, that's a bit ironical, we had established partnerships with Canada and Ukraine. That's also revealing about supply risks, by the way, and underlining the importance of diversifications. And we are now busy working on partnerships with other countries, and notably we've got 6 pilot projects in Africa. Second work stream, industrial alliances within the EU. We consider that when you put all the actors together of a given ecosystem, you can considerably reinforce our capacities in Europe. Because there
I això et permet identificar i també crear reserves de projecte, de manera que la gent arribi amb les seves idees i podem veure quin coneixement necessitem per concretar-los, i després els subministradors, els clients, etc. Podeu imaginar-vos, per exemple, que la indústria de fabricació de cotxes, un cop has creat la fabricació o la fàbrica, necessitaràs l'encàrrec de comprar tantes bateries sempre que puguis garantir que puguin estar llestes amb una data específica i un preu específic. I per tant, un cop tens aquesta modalitat, pots tenir doncs, la inversió a la fàbrica. Aquesta és la lògica.
With batteries, and we've been quite successful. We've got more than 200 companies in Europe participating in that, and we basically, on the basis of the alliance, we've also launched 2 IPCIs. So that's a sort of a strange word. IPCI stays for important projects of common European interest. And basically, these projects are projects which are proposed by a certain number of member states, a minimum of 3. So you don't have to have the 27 going for it. But then when they say we are ready to put public investment beside putting money beside private money in order to give a push, and then we've got the European Investment Bank that allows us also to de-risk certain projects or to reduce the risk. And the beauty of it as well is that these state aids that these member states give is provided it can assert certain conditions, is subject to certain flexibility vis-à-vis our competition rules, so that things go faster and so on. We've got 2 in the batteries area, which actually allowed us to mobilize a lot of money. Basically, all in all, these 2 projects only will allow us to put roughly 20 billion euros in investment in batteries. And we intend to do the same in this clean hydrogen domain. We've created the alliance last November, and we have already an investment pipeline of 750 projects, only on hydrogen, that the members of the alliance are ready to get started by between now and 2030. And the last work stream we're working is what I would call horizontal actions, or horizontal sectorial actions. Basically what we do in the Commission, but basically what do we do in the Commission? We give money or we regulate. And that's easy. And I've always been saying, if you want to have an interesting life as a Commission official, you either manage funds or you regulate. So I'm more on the regulatory side. The only advantage for people who manage funds is that everybody's nice with them because they whereas when you regulate, you're always shouted at because it's never good enough. You know, you always it's usually the test for knowing that you've got good legislation, that you did good legislation, is that everybody says criticizes it. At least it means it's balanced. There, in this regulatory aspect, I'll give you some examples of what we do. We've got sectoral legislation, of course. We've got, I'm personally in charge of 2/3 of the internal market legislation for goods. So it goes from machinery, lifts, recreational crafts or leisure boats, to construction products or automotive, chemicals, you name it. Pharmaceuticals, the medicines that we own that are available. You've got horizontal actions and horizontal regulation. For example, standardization. We issued last, I was in charge, I should remember. Was it February or March? I don't know, but that was, last February, I think. Last February, a new standardization strategy. And I'll give you I'll give you that example so that you see what we are doing with legislation. But public procurement is another one as well, where we can orientate the market, and all that to stimulate and to facilitate innovation and investment in all domains. I mentioned that I would give you the example of standardization so that to give you a hint of what we're doing. We issued the standardization strategy, and the 5 areas where we actually want to intervene. The first thing is to get the standardization system work properly. I mean, be faster, because technologies are going faster. So we want to put oil in the system so that it goes faster, so that we get the standards faster, not 3 years after they are needed. The second thing is to actually ensure integrity and improve the governance of our standardization system. We work with 3 European standardization organizations, of which national standardization bodies are the members. But we want to be sure, because they produce standards that are actually supporting, we call them harmonized standards, which are European standards that actually give you, if you're a manufacturer, the presumption of conformity to our legislation. So they're not legislation, but if you apply these standards, you are presumed conform to the legislation. So it's much easier for a manufacturer, rather than to have to demonstrate for each time that his product is safe. They apply the standard, and it has access to the market. We've got 3 organizations, as said. Sen, Senelec, and Etsy. Sen is for general goods, Senelec is for electronic goods, and Etsy is for ICT. And there, to my surprise, when I took over that file 18 months ago, I realized that in one of these organizations, the last one, the more you pay, the more you vote. And unfortunately, the ones who pay the most are Huawei, and the second one is Apple. So for me, it was conceptually a small problem when standards that are underpinning European legislation are adopted according to a voting system where European players do not have the monopoly. So we're changing that. To give you an example, so basically everybody is welcome to participate in European standardization still, but we want the decision-making stages to be only adopted by Europeans for Europeans. This legislative amendment is now being examined by the Council of Ministers and by the European Parliament. It looks good, so I mean, we will start what we call in our jargon the trialogue, so where you've got the three institutions, Parliament, Council, and Commission. We will start after a summer break in autumn, so that hopefully before Christmas we will have solved the problem. Third thing that we want to do is to reinforce our presence on the international scene. ISO, IEC, the international standardization organizations. And there, we are not members of it, European Commission, no member state is. It's the national standardization bodies that are present. But to give you an example of the situation I've been confronted with when I was dealing with raw materials, I got a phone call one day from Australia. An Australian colleague said, "Gwen, are you aware?" I said, "What?" "The Chinese have proposed the creation of a technical committee in ISO on lithium." Well, lithium is quite essential for batteries. And if you define the standards on lithium, you can have some influence on the batteries and then the automotive sector. But what is interesting with that example is that this piece of course, we worked on that, but this piece of information was provided to me. This phone call came from Australia because I just happened to know an Australian. None of our 27 national standardization bodies lifted the phone and said, "Gwen, are you aware?" So they were all sleeping. So we are trying to change that as well, to improve coordination within EU so that we can be more active, either to promote our priorities on the international scene or to be alert on our defensive thing. And by the way, we're not limiting that to Europeans. We've also an exercise which is called the Trade and Technological Council with the US, where we basically have agreed to have what we call the standardization, this strategic instrument mechanism, which actually intends to do exactly the same thing. And we do not want to limit it to the US because we've got other friends called Japan, for example, or Canada, or, as my example proves, Australia, that could be interested actually to be more proactive and also to be more alert when things, undesired things on the international scene could occur. And finally, better links, no, not finally, but better link standardization with research. At the moment, what you see is that the researchers, they function, they work, and then once, at a certain moment, that product will come to the market, and then people ask themselves the question of standards. And then you've lost 3 years. I experienced that with batteries. We started, and then 3 years later, they said, but we'll need standards. But that's 3 years lost. We could have involved the standardizers from the beginning, and they could have worked together to identify early what the standards are needed so that they exceed the market faster. And the last element is the future of standardization. We could fill in the Camp Nou with European standardizers. We've got 100,000. But and the unfortunate thing is that community of standardizers is aging and is very male. So by definition, I have nothing against men, but an old man on top of that. But we want to change that, to have men and women, and to have the next generation ready. But for that, we need standardization courses in universities and so on, in engineers, in School of Engineers, Because very often what we observe is that standardization is not taught at all. So people have their curriculum, but they have no idea that standardization will be essential at a certain stage. So to have specific courses, so we're working there with member states because, of course, education is not a competence that we have at the European level, but we want to work with so it gives you an idea of what we're trying to do with a specific case of standardization, support of our, I would say, strategic place. I can give you other examples because I always think that giving illustration is good. Regulation is very often, if you hear industry, or that's a caricature, regulation, it's costly, it's administrative burden, it's terrible. For the batteries, industry, they were the first ones to come to us and say, we need eco-design regulation because we want to produce a battery where materials are recoverable, where you can have a second use, then at the end when it can be recycled and so on. Because that's how we will differentiate our product vis-à-vis batteries imported from Asia. So it can also be something that gives you a competitive advantage. It can also be, regulation can also be something that reinforces your trust in technology. At the moment, I have a legislative proposal on machinery products. Well, machinery products, you think of a machine, but it's also the robots. So it's also artificial intelligence and so on. And since it's also artificial intelligence, this is the first time we will regulate artificial intelligence. To give you the type of problem we've got is that until now, we've always been looking at the product, testing it, before it's put on the market. With artificial intelligence, you can do that, but it's not going to help you a lot because the behavior of the product changes after it's been introduced on the market. So what we're trying to do is to have a regulatory framework that fits with that new thing. And of course, you've got some parts of the machinery industry that say, these guys in Brussels, they want to over-regulate. But imagine for a second, for that or for automated cars that are going to come, that we don't legislate and that they put the product on the market, and then you've got accidents. Your technology is dead, at least in Europe. In the US, no. In the US, you can try and hit. They consider it's part of the, 2, 3, 4 casualties. But these 2, 3, 4 casualties in Europe, your technology is dead. On a sort of humoristic way, I used to say that when the mobile phone was invented, it's put on the market in the US, the first American citizen said, oh, gee, I'm going to be able to call from the street. Yeah, okay. And his European colleague said, oh, isn't that going to give me a brain cancer? So that's, it's of course an exaggeration, but that's a bit the approach. So from that point of view, regulation can give confidence and can allow technology, can allow to innovate. Last but not least, I mentioned that R&D. We have increased, again, jargon, multi-annual financial framework. That's basically our budget. We adopt our budget every year, like every member state, but on top of that, we've got this 7 years financial framework, which actually gives the overall sum we're going to have during the 7 years. So we not only have an annual budget, but we've got a budget for 7 years. MFF, it's called. And for the last MFF, the overall budget that's available for the EU was reduced. Believe it or not. I can tell you our workload has not reduced, but that's okay. And the domains in which we have to intervene have increased. But despite of that, our budget has been reduced. And but there's one part of the budget which has almost doubled. That's R&D, research and development. That gives you the idea of the priority we put in there. So, it's not been increased. We also there's also an effort to make it closer to the market. Because, we say that there's another thing that innovation is transforming ideas into money. Research is transforming money into ideas. So, transforming money into ideas is good, but transforming ideas into money is not bad either. So we want to do both. Yeah. So basically, that gives you a picture of what we're trying to do. I don't know whether I've been exhaustive enough, but I'm open to your questions now.
Thank you, Gwen, for this overview. Now we still have at least 20-30 minutes for questions.
Oh, I was more or less in time.
Yeah, it was perfect. So I would like to receive from the audience questions. Know that you can ask in English, Catalan, or Spanish. We have a translation. And I would like to start with an idea that has not appeared in your presentation, but since the backbone of the European industry are SMEs, which has to be the SMEs' role in this new industry led by tech giants? How SMEs can survive, or how can at least grow, facing the competence or the intensive needs of investment that are required?
Yeah, I mean, there are various elements there. The first thing to mention is that in our policy, we have a specific reflection on SMEs. Either we adapt the rules to SMEs, or we make the costs of it smaller for SMEs when possible. There's one thing which we do not do for SMEs, is that when we've got legislation with the safety requirement, safety is not negotiable. I mean, be a big company or a small company, the product has to be safe. The thing, I must admit that the fact that we've got a functioning internal market is also very positive for SMEs. The difficulty we've got very much in Europe is for the SMEs to go to basically to the next stage. Mm-hmm. And we're trying to work, it's mainly with member states there, and at national or regional level, that these measures can be undertaken. What we could do is to work to see what the best practices are, so that member states can inspire each other of the ideas they've got. That's the role of facilitator we've got. We do not have, with the tools we have, we also have rules for research, for example, that are much easier for SMEs. Mm-hmm. And we always want to make them easier, but there I mentioned, I'll show you the type of contradictions to which we are sometimes confronted. We go to the Parliament and to the Council, and we say we would like to ease those rules for SMEs. Yes, ease the rules for SMEs. And then you look at the budget, and when you've got the discussion on the budget for research, they want that and that discipline, that and that control, that and that red tape, and so on. So basically, it's always a sort of, I mean, just with that example, it's always a sort of dilemma between easing the procedure but making sure the money is well spent, you know. And so that's always the tension. We push always for flexibility, but I must admit sometimes we are limited from that point of view. Yeah? But it's understandable as well. I mean, taxpayers' money has to be managed properly.
You already mentioned how dependent we are on third countries, especially after the pandemic. We have seen it, and the consequence of the accelerated globalization that we have seen in the last years. And you also mentioned some measures in order to reestablish the industry. You talk about specific strategic areas, but how could really implement or achieve this new industrialization? How can we, what the European Union can do to reindustrialize Europe in terms of having new companies, but not also companies in terms of employment, for instance, and new quality employment? This rebirth of the industry, how it must be?
So, two things. First, globalization has been positive by a lot of aspects. That has allowed to reduce the cost of goods that people would not have afford buying otherwise, and so on. So not everything is to be thrown away as far as globalization is concerned. As I mentioned, we still consider that open markets are necessary. I would say open but not naive. So that would be the. So that's perhaps not saying, of course, we are naive, but okay. Open but not naive, which also explains that as far as our trade policy, which I did not mention, that also contributes to industrial policy, if you wish. We have seen the development in the recent years of very new instruments. We've been used to free trade agreements, and we continue with free trade agreements. We had Canada, we've negotiated one with Mercosur, with the one been negotiating at the moment with New Zealand. But what is new is that we have modified our rules for what we call the trade defense mechanisms, trade defense instruments, anti-dumping, for example, where in the past, for example, we were obliged to always apply what we used to call the lesser duty rule, which is basically the minimum compensating customs duty to compensate the damage done, the damage calculated, which is inferior to the level of dumping. You know, you've got the level of dumping, then you calculate the level of damage. And we were obliged to apply this customs duty corresponding to the level of damage, which in certain cases was unsatisfactory. So we've got rid, and that rule still exists, but it's not compulsory anymore. We can compensate the full dumping. Mm-hmm. We've also introduced a system which is basically what we call foreign direct investment screening. So for example, for the sectors I'm in charge, each foreign direct investment that is foreseen, we screen and we see whether it's acceptable or not, or whether it's strategically a risk or not. You know, a European company is going to be bought by a British company, mm-hmm. or by an American company, or by a Chinese company. Then we have the possibility to intervene. So that's one thing in terms of the defensive. But in terms of reindustrializing, I think there are various things. The first thing is to have the conditions right. So promote research, promote research, have the internal market that functions because it gives you a good base. Work with national and regional level as well for the measures so that our policies are aligned. It's extremely important that policy. We see it works when the three levels are aligned in their objectives. They don't have the same instruments. Therefore, if the instruments work in the same direction, the synergies are good. And I think to link a bit what we do with the alliances and the IPCIs, basically when we see elements, of course SMEs are part of it, from the very beginning. Mm-hmm. They're part of the ecosystem, and they cooperate with bigger players. That's sometimes very efficient.
Sometimes.
Yes, sometimes. No, I mean, the experience I have is that it's very efficient. I can give you a startup, Northvolt, Swedish startup. Uh-huh. I've been there. They were 20, working on batteries in Sweden. Actually, of the 20, you had the boss, who was Swedish, you had another fellow who was Swedish, and all the others were Japanese and Koreans. Yeah, because in battery chemistry, we have lost all our knowledge in Europe. So basically, in that particular case, in order to reacquire our knowledge, we needed to import engineers from Asia, and now they're recruiting Europeans who will actually be trained by these Asian engineers. There was a European, non-EU, but there was a European engineer. It was actually a Turkish chemistry engineer, battery chemistry engineer, who had immigrated first to Germany, didn't find a job, and then he went to Sweden, and the CEO of that company met him when he was cleaning his office. He's in his past job. So that's how we use, sometimes it's also the way we use the brains of people who immigrate.
We have an example here in this industry. Wallbox is one of our recent success stories. It's a startup that was created here 6 years ago. They grow, but they went listed to Wall Street. They couldn't stay here to grow. Yeah. They couldn't find the resources here.
There we have that's a real weakness. That's true, and that's why with these IPCIs and EIB, European Investment Bank intervention and state aids, and that's why I consider that helps. But it's also at national level when you've got these financial instruments. the big difference we've got with the US in terms of financing is that they've got a lot of risk capital, and they've got much more risk capital, venture capital than we've got. And also, one has to admit that there's a lot of capital available because of the funds, including pension funds. But the question is also, that's more complex, do we Europeans want to invest individually for our pension so that we've got venture funds, pension funds that will invest in our companies, or do we have another concept of social security? So, I mean, sometimes we make democratic choices and we assume the consequences.
So it's more about the culture in Europe than it's what's first, the culture or the policy? What's first, the culture or the policy, right?
No, I think we can do a lot of things improving policy, but there are also democratic choices that we might not want to change. So that's the thing.
Podem obrir, si voleu, la conversa. No sé si
But this
voleu...
being said, perhaps just to say, we see now for the last few years that there is an element of reindustrialization coming in. One has to admit as well that industry was, I'm talking in particular of certain industries, but or some industries in certain member states, was not thinking geopolitically enough.
Was not enough.
They were basically what can be rational. They were minimizing cost, maximizing profit. So basically, which is efficient. And it's macroeconomics by training, so I mean, it makes sense. This being said, if you want to have a, I mean, as I say, we usually say, economy is not the alpha and the omega. The world doesn't stop there. There are also externalities to be taken into consideration, and this geopolitical risk is one of them. And you've got two types of exposure, either because you source too much from risk, what I exemplified with raw materials, for example. There's another risk of which nobody, I mean, when I say basically, it must be a personal obsession. Not a lot of people speak, is actually what I would say the demand geopolitical risk. I mean, I think of a car company in particular that has got 40% of its market in China. But the day China closes the border...
An European company.
Yeah. The day China closes the border, it's 40% of its sales that are gone. Okay, it's been big market, growing market, but isn't that risky? But give me the name of one company that thinks in those terms. I will be careful about the percentage of that market in my turnover. I don't know any.
Voleu preguntes?
So, who would like to ask questions, please?
Leo, I have a question regarding open markets that you talked at the beginning of your speech. We have seen during the last years that many emerging powers in terms of technology and industrial, like South Korea or Japan, are kind of increasing the competitiveness between the European Union. And you also talk about many strategies that we're implementing or trying to implement to increase its strategic independence in terms of technology. Can these strategies derive into protectionist measures and kind of end this free market that we have witnessed during the recent years?
Frankly, what we see today, because I didn't bring my crystal ball, so I mean, but what we've seen, and I'm not talking of the US for 2 to 6 years ago. There, of course, we saw frictions on trade. Since Biden has arrived, things are back to a sort of reality, a certain normality. I think you've got different players there. I know Japan very well. I've never seen protectionism in Japan. Not a Japanese trend. The fact that there is competition between European and Japanese companies is fair. They've also got standards. We work actually together on the international scene for standardization in cars. When we try, for example, when we want to have standards safety of cars, we speak with the Japanese first. we try to agree, and then the Europeans and Japanese come in Geneva, in the UN Economic Commission for Europe, where standards for cars are being developed. I can tell you that if the Europeans and Japanese come with a common proposal, look at the global production of cars, we represent the two of us. So we have some weight. So there I do not see it. What you see typically is the Chinese market, which is not an easy one, and there where naivety is still not on. A risk that is identified by certain people is that the globalization, first, it's not a risk. The first thing, globalization will have to be moderated in the sense of what I was talking in terms of strategic dependencies. So basically, there are things we will wish to produce at home. But it doesn't mean that we close the border. For example, the batteries, it doesn't mean that we close the border. It means that we differentiate our products. They will be cleaner and so on. So that's a way as well to guarantee it. So we help the financing, we help the launch. In private investment is there, then you secure the demand by actually putting requirements on the products that are being sold. But if the Japanese, and they probably will be, if they're able to produce batteries that respect those standards, that will be the market. You know, so there will still be globalization. What I was mentioning, the risk is because there's a possibility of that, is a sort of decoupling, and that will not be generated by EU, but we might have to be alert and to look at that because it could happen between US and China. This being said, to tell you the truth, they're so interlinked at the moment that if they were to decouple, that would not be without difficulty. You know that you know who owns the American debt.
Thank you.
Hi, good morning. My name is Marti, and I had a question regarding artificial intelligence. You mentioned it from a regulatory point of view, but I was wondering if you think that actually investing in industries that fund or develop and research this kind of technology would actually help the industries of Europe actually catch up and like kind of reduce the dependency, kind of leapfrogging, you know, when in terms of these dependencies that we have. Like, what do you think about it?
Yeah, I think each time there's a key enabling technology, and artificial intelligence is one. We have full interest in going for it fast and heavily, for various reasons. First, because it's a market. Second, because it makes in that case, your production more efficient. But it's also the future market. So basically, that's where the future engineers, the future technicians will find a job. Contrary to what people say that robots will steal my job, they will create a lot as well. And the third element, which is for me perhaps the most important on top of it, is that the way you go for it, you influence the market and you influence the thinking. And especially with artificial intelligence, we have European values, not only European interests, but European values to defend. But if you're not on the market, if you come for nothing, you don't influence anything. You just take the product or the technology developed by others. And that's certainly not what we want to do. So that's true with cyber, that's true with artificial intelligence, typically, where we want European values to be decided by Europeans, but we need to be present somewhere, you know, on the market.
Good morning, my name is Pablo. Following the idea of Marty, I want to ask you about the industry and application to the common industry goods. We are used to
the industry goods.
Mm-hmm. We are used to know and catch phrases from the European Union about key industries such as digital or green transformation. But when the pandemic struck, the thing we lacked, it wasn't advanced technology, it wasn't planes, it was facial masks. Mm-hmm. That are the basic technology that we can have. It would make more sense to catch within these industries too that are proved that have been strategic for Europe.
And that's what I mentioned with active pharmaceutical ingredients. That's why we want to go through that analysis, because it's true, it's not only digital and green, and we don't want to miss one. So that's the exercise we're now have started last year or 2 years ago, and that's what we basically intend to continue, not to miss. This being said, there is no guarantee that we won't miss. I mean, it might well be that something happens. On the other hand, talking about personal protection equipment, there are choices to make. How do you preserve yourself from the problem? Because once you've identified, you can decide, okay, I do production in Europe. Great. It might be that it's competitive. It might be that it needs some investment at the beginning to be competitive later. It might mean that it will never be competitive. So in that case, you've got the choice. You can decide, okay, I need that product. I want it to be sure to access the product. I'm going to subsidize it ad vitam aeternam. Yeah, okay, that's a choice. You can say, I mix stocks. You can say I diversify my supply from various countries. And for each product, it will be different. For example, if you ask me, should we produce gloves, medical gloves in Europe? I'll say if you decide to do that, your taxpayers might, if you're a politician, might throw you out at next election. Because the capital investment is enormous. And anyway, the raw material, rubber, you don't have in Europe. It's in Southeast Asia. So you will not be depending on the gloves, but you will be depending on rubber. So, I mean, there are things where perhaps there's making stocks is more appropriate. You know, each time you have to look at, I'll give you an example, another example. Lithium, used batteries. We import a lot of lithium from Chile. When we never had a problem of Chile refusing to export lithium, one can be considered as a safe supplier. And by the way, we intend to increase production in Europe as well, which is another option. But provided people accept the idea that in order to green economy, we might need some mines, which is also a contradiction in our democratic debate. But lithium, until now, it's changing. No, I'll reassure you it's changing, but until now, getting all the lithium we want from Chile doesn't give us any guarantee that we will have the lithium for our batteries. Why? Because we don't have a single lithium refinery in Europe, the processing stage. So basically, imagine yourself, you get a raw material from a third country, and you export everything to China for it to be refined and come back, hopefully come back. So that's the type of thing we're changing, for example. But that we could do with the Batteries Alliance, because that allowed us actually putting all the actors together to say, oh, lithium refining, that's a problem, you know? I mean, it's not a commercial official in its office behind closed doors, closed windows that had that illumination that the lithium refining was a problem. It's the people who are working in the ecosystem.
It's another question.
So we are moving towards a production change inside Europe. Beside the raw materials, we are content that lack those raw materials. But your idea is that we are moving towards that objective, towards research, design, and production inside the European Union?
No, when needed, we will do it in Europe. You know, when needed and feasible. But it's not always needed by far, and it's not always feasible. In that case, you've got alternative strategies that can be diversification of sourcing, that can be alternative processes, that can be making stocks. You know, you've got a palette of instruments. But this has to be based on a sound analysis first. What is absolutely necessary? And since we want that, what is the best strategy in order to secure a supply? Which is not always, I'll do it myself, you know.
Have a last question, András.
Because, by the way, if we do it ourselves for everything, then you will have citizens who will not be happy either, because then they will see the cost of the products.
Yeah, I would like to pick a question from our online audience. The question's from Dancy and says...
Can you raise your voice a bit?
Yeah.
Speak louder.
It's a question from our online audience and from Dancy, who says, what possible role in European R&D dynamics can adopt the comprehensive agreement on investment? Shall we expect China to become a closer partner in this reindustrialization process?
You mean in industrialization process or in research?
Yeah, well, she says in reindustrialization.
Reindustrialization.
So the Chinese as a more important partner,
As a closer partner, yeah.
as far as industrialization is concerned. I think that what I explained earlier on was clear enough, no? Okay. The reindustrialization process has to be undertaken in cooperation with partners. I mean, everybody is welcome, but taking also security concerns into account. So that's my answer to it.
We run out of time. I had a last question about the next generation program. We had great expectations put on that. I'm not sure if it's working the way it was expected. I don't know if you can give us some insights on how the deployment and the effects of these funds can have or are still having in this transition or digitalization and green transition process.
It's still early days, but from what I've been looking at the recovery facility for last year. I'm not in charge anymore, but actually I was in charge of following it from a DG Grow point of view for 9 member states. You know, we were 3 directors. We decided to split 27 by 3, and guess what? Even Commission officials can find that 27 divided by 3 is 9. So. And among my 9 countries, actually I had Spain, which is the biggest beneficiary proportionally of the fund. And from what I see, I came to Madrid a few months ago, and the speed was fantastic. The priorities were actually perfectly well aligned. You know that we've got a minimum of 37 digital, 20% green. Spain is even above those percentages. The disbursements were actually the first ones made. We made the money available to Spain, which was the first one to get the money, the first amount of money. And I think, from what I hear, the money is flowing now. Okay, but that's a federal system, so afterwards it's not for me anymore. But I mean, as far as in certain other member states, it's been slower for various reasons, because in certain member states. You had a change of government, you had elections, so therefore the process was a bit slower. In certain others, perhaps they didn't work as fast as Spain. In others, as you know, it took longer for us to approve, because of other issues, safety of the funds that would be given, like Hungary. Or for certain, the money has not been disbursed yet, like Poland, but that's other factors. But all in all, I think it's appreciated by member states who have started. But it's still the early days.
So let's see how.
And in the meantime, we've got Ukraine, of course.
Thank you, Wen. It's been really enriching having your insights that I'm sure will help us navigate these challenging times. Thank you very much, and now it's time to grab a coffee, and us esperem a tots aquí.
And we'll be waiting at 1:45. I think that's when the next panel will be starting to talk about 3 experts in political and industrial and technological industries. Thank you.
Bon dia de nou, tornem.
Good morning again. We're starting again after our session with the representative from the European Commission. We now have a panel with 3 experts with the idea of continuing to talk about the challenges of industrial and technological policies at the European level. As before, we will have a little over half an hour to get a small overview from each of our panelists, and afterwards we will be opening up the debate until 1, which is we have about an hour and a quarter in conversation. Again, you can follow the session in Catalan, Spanish or English because of the 4 panelists on the table, 3 of us are Catalan, so we have decided that we will hold the session in Catalan, and Clément will be following along. I think we're going to end up speaking Catalan, or at least understanding it, but he will be speaking in Spanish or English. So please feel free to chip in whatever language you feel most comfortable in. Let me introduce our guests. Here's Carme Colomina, who is a researcher at CIDOB. We have Clément Nebru, who is a political analyst at the European Parliament in the studies segment of the European Parliament, as well as Albert Cuesta, who is an expert and journalist in technology and consumer goods and information technologies, as well as a colleague. I always say I write about things that you plug. So we're going to start with Albert, and he will be offering his vision on the European political and technological situation, and then we'll be moving on to Clément, and then Carme, and then we'll be talking amongst ourselves. But we encourage you to take the chance of the short distance that we have to hold a joint conversation. Albert, take it away. Thank you to CIDOB for inviting me, and thank you all for being here. When I was invited to speak in this session, I thought, oh gosh, industrial Europe, technological Europe. And then let's see what I get from that. And what I thought about was a few companies, a few names of the heavyweights in the European industry. And let me tell you that I discarded pharmaceutical companies because they're not strictly speaking technologies. They're a entirely different business, as well as energy companies, because they do have an important technological aspect, but they're regulated, etc., etc. And I thought about brands, products, and companies and names that are present not just in Europe, but around the world. And this dozen is what I got. They could be 14. There's not strict criteria in my selection. It's just the level of revenue is very different. But as you can see, Volkswagen, why are they here? Because they're among the first and second world producer of cars, of vehicles. I mean, they're neck and neck with Toyota, but basically Volkswagen for many years was the main automobile producer in the world, because you know they also have brands like Audi, Porsche, and many others that we probably don't remember. Siemens, well, they're an industrial giant. They do lots of things, trains, energy, wind energy, etc. Continental, you probably, they remember them by their tires, but they're a German company that produces automobile parts, and I would say they do about 1/4 of the electronics of cars for a multitude of brands. And I mean, cars more and more are becoming computers, and they're these central panels that control the car functions, and Continental does a large part of those. And the other company that also does a lot of this part of electronics for cars is Bosch, Robert Bosch. You probably know them for their electrical domestic appliances, but they do huge amounts of sensors of all kinds that are used in vehicles, industries, etc. KUKA, you've all seen those videos in car factories that have these robot arms that do the soldering and whatnot, and KUKA is the German company that produces those robots. It was German. The Chinese purchased it 2 years ago because they were like, we want to be top leaders in this industry, and there's industries around the world using KUKA robots, which is originally German. Ericsson, what can I tell you about them? There are 3 large companies that build mobile antennas: Nokia, Huawei, and Ericsson. Ericsson is one of the 3 greats. Nokia is another one at the bottom, and I mean, everyone knows them more or less for their mobile phones. Now we have Nokia phones. But I mean, they sunk when the iPhone and Android phones came out, but they keep making telecommunications networks, submarine optic fiber networks. Many things that you do on the internet are there thanks to a cable installed by a Nokia boat, actually originally belonging to Alcatel, which was then purchased by Nokia. But basically what they do is install the optic fiber company, which the other company doing this is Huawei, but they're obviously not European. ABB is a European company, not European Union because they're Swiss, but they do industrial equipment, robots and automatization for industries around the world. Philips. You remember there was a time when Philips would do music products, would do televisions, and they were the largest technological industry in Europe. They were behind the cassette tape creation. You probably still remember cassette tapes and CDs. They were a joint invention between Philips and Sony, a Dutch company, and a Japanese company, which are somehow present in many homes around the world. Nowadays, Philips basically devote themselves to lighting and electromedicine equipment. BASF is the most important company in the petrochemical complex in Tarragona, but they do chemical plastic products around the world. Who am I missing? Oh, Airbus. I mean, Airbus is, as of now, the first world producer of passenger planes, and I also think cargo planes. And they overtook its American rival Boeing. And if you go now on a Ryanair when they're not striking, or a Vueling plane, and they're going to be a product of a consortium, basically French, German, with some Italian and Spanish participation, but they're Europe-made. And Thales, you probably don't know them as much, but they're an interesting European technological agency born out of the merger between a French Thomson. Probably you've heard of Thomson. Maybe you used to have a Thomson television at your house, as well as Rackle, which is a British company back outside of the European Union. They're basically they're in the continent, and they're devoted to defense electronics. After making this list, and I could have added more companies to it, but it occurred to me, do you see a pattern here? And let me tell you what it is. They're all very old companies, except for Thales, which was founded in 1950s, which is when Racal was founded. Volkswagen, which was founded in 1937 in Nazi Germany. And Airbus, which was founded through a merger of aerospatial companies in Spain, France, and Germany in 1970, all others are pretty much 150 years old. So the industrial way with a technological aspect to it in Europe is long coming. And it has remained so because these companies have been reinventing themselves. Siemens, when it was founded in 1847, had no idea it would end up buying Gamesa, which is a wind turbine company. And Nokia started, and I mean, this is cheating, but when it started, Nokia wasn't doing antennas or phones. They were doing rubber boots, just to give you an idea. But each of these companies started. Philips started by making light bulbs, just to give you an idea. These are all old companies. What's going on? Doesn't Europe have a modern industry of its own? And by industry, I mean someone that makes things, products that bring value and that people will want to buy. And yes, as it turns out, we do have some modern industry. I have chosen 3 companies that are European. One is ASML, which is a Dutch company. And on this company, the entire world production of advanced chips is dependent. There are 3 large companies producing advanced chips, like the ones you have in your mobile phones, Intel, Samsung, and that's it pretty much. And all these companies necessarily have to use machines produced by ASML in the Netherlands, and each of them is worth more than 150 million euros, and they wouldn't fit in this room. And the demand is so high, they can't keep up with it. The president of Samsung, the CEO of Samsung visited the Netherlands recently, and since he was processed by for corruption lately, so he had to get a special permit to exit the country and be able to beg, to go to the Netherlands, to beg this company to give them more machines to make chips. And they're selling these machines to China as well. Yes, the main world producer of chips, chips present in iPhones and the Qualcomm chips used by other mobile phones. They're produced by a Taiwanese company called TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductors Manufacturing Corporation, but they're used by these ultraviolet lithography reactors produced by ASML in the Netherlands, and they can't keep up with the demand. So the man from Samsung came all the way to beg them to give them more machines because they can't keep up. On the other hand, we have NXP, which is a company that also makes chips. For instance, they're behind, when you do a mobile payment or when you use your bus pass on your phone, these nearness chips are basically all produced by NXP. Both are incidentally spin-offs born out of Philips. Philips has been shitting, pardon my French, around the world, and they're all born out of Philips. And I think they also produce the modems in iPhones. Apple could not produce phones that could connect to 4G, 5G networks around the world without Infineon chips, which is also a spin-off of Siemens, also present in the previous slide. So we do have some modern industry, but it is in large part thanks to these industrial dinosaurs that we have in Europe. Since we have Mar here, I actually wanted you to explain the Fractus case from the previous slide. Oh, that's right, yes, Fractus. Fractus is a great example. Mar has a wonderful book called Barcelona Startup, which explains the evolution of how budding technological companies in Barcelona have been growing. And I remember actually when she was writing the book, we said, what companies do you think are relevant from here? And I say Fractus. Fractus is a company, I won't be going into too much detail, but these guys come out of the Catalan UPC University and they design antennas for mobile phones. I mean, mobile phones have a bunch of antennas, the Wi-Fi antenna, mobile antenna, Bluetooth antenna. And this is actually the company, the fractal antenna that they designed, enabled every phone in the world to lose their protruding antennas that they used to have. So from one day to the next, overnight, all phones in the world, and you please correct me if I'm mistaken, I'm butting in, Albert, all phones in the world lose their antennas overnight. And this was just a company born out of the UPC University, 2 engineers that started the company. And I brought this because they started making antennas. And they came to realize that they were opening mobiles, they would buy phones around the world, and they all didn't have an appendix antenna. They had a fractal antenna, which hadn't been made by them, because they tried to establish a factory in Korea, in China, to try to make antennas around the world. And when they realized everyone was copying them, what they did was pivot, and instead of continuing productions, they had suspended payments on the table, they were selling to Qualcomm, so they had several options. Please read that book, Barcelona Startup. Well, and Ruben, one of the founders of the company, is publishing a book in September where he explains the story. And I think it's one of the biggest cases we have in Catalonia on how to do the technological transference and how we need to get technology out of universities and turn it into riches, into added value. But the thing is that they agreed on they would either sue all mobile makers in the world. They didn't get to sue Apple because they settled out of court, but they were sued in a Texas court and they won. So they're still getting royalties from every big mobile phone maker because of unfair use of their technology. If Fractus was a company in Israel, children in Israel would be saying that they want to create Fractus, or they would be wanting to work in Fractus, seeing how everyone living in Erlangen wants to work on Siemens, which is where they have their headquarters. So these are things that have this feedback. But really, you must read Mar's book. No, really. So I thought, well, and with this new economy, with the new digital economy, because everything we've been saying right now do have some digital component. When we talk about services and products and things living in the cloud and that people will pay for, I have found 3 cases of European companies that really have a world presence. One of them is Skype, which was born in Letland and is no longer European because it was bought by Microsoft a few years ago, so it's now American. The other one is SAP, which you probably haven't heard of, but if you are used to Conta Plus, which is a small company accounting program, well, this is what everyone is using. It's a German company that has this program for accounting, billing, supply management and whatnot. And most big companies in the world who aren't using Salesforce, they use SAP, just so you know. And the third one is Spotify, which is Swedish. They've built a business model on top of music content distribution, audio content, because now they're more interested in podcasts than music through the internet. And I have to say that the European participation in Spotify has decreased because the big record majors started putting money in it. There's no... Sorry, yes, there's one that's European, Warner, Sony, and the third one is... Never mind. So its capital isn't fully European.
What do I mean? Well, I do not know to which extent Europe, clearly Skype, sites are very important, but all of them have significant competitors from outside of Europe, and they are not at all in the, they do not have the volume that big Silicon Valley techs have, with whom we compete, and I believe Karma will give us some figures about this. They are not at all at the same level as Google, Apple, Meta, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft. Let's say, that doesn't mean that Europe is not good from the point of view of innovation. For example, there are some success cases, one of which is related relatively to Spotify in Europe. MP3, for example, which is the standard distribution format for internet music. And, well, it is a European development, specifically German. It was developed at the Fraunhofer Institute in Germany, which is a center for research transfer. And another great success case is digital mobile telephony. We are at 5G now. I reckon you have all heard of it. Some of your mobiles are 5G, and maybe you have coverage 5G, which is an altogether different thing. But that comes from 2G, which was the first digital mobile telephony. It's GSM, and that's a European technology. In other words, that was created basically by 2 of the companies that appeared in the first slide, Nokia and Ericsson. And it could have been more European, because if there is something that happens to Europe, is that it talks little with a single voice when it comes to having a technological patent. When the GSM was designed, i.e. the digital telephony system, an informal consortium won between Ericsson and Nokia, 2 Scandinavian companies. One is Swedish and the other one is Finnish. But another informal European consortium lost, which was basically Siemens, one of the previous ones, which is German, and Alcatel, which is French. So the Scandinavians actually won against the Continentals. But patents, to explain some specific issues. Europe has a hard time speaking with a single voice. The organization that manages the world patent system is in Europe, in Geneva. And among the 5 countries that registered more patents, there is only a single one. The first country in the world in terms of registered patents is China. The second one was the USA, which till 2 years before, for 40 years, was the one who registered more patents. The third one was Japan. The gentleman from the European Commission talked about Japan. We should never lose sight of Japan. The fourth one is the first European one, Germany. But Germany on its own, not Europe. And the last one is South Korea, where we have LG, Samsung, Hyundai, and all of these big companies. What I mean that we do not play the role, a leadership role at a world scale in the technological front. But I do not want to be overly negative. We are good at certain issues. For example, regulation. I don't know whether you know this lady, Margaret Stager. She's the Vice President of the European Commission in charge. I can't recall her exact post. Probably our colleague can tell us. But she, with the current government of Ursula von der Leyen, she's more important than beforehand. And she is the sock of American technological industry. She's the one that has made, with her colleague Thierry Breton, French, she has made that Europe, the Parliament and the Commission has promoted two very important laws. The Directive on Digital Markets and the Directive on Digital Services, which protect, on the one hand, free competition between digital companies, and on the other hand, data and privacy, the data and privacy of European consumers. How can she afford that? Silicon Valley is very concerned about this, but because it changes completely their business model, which is based on the exploitation of personal data and monopolistic practices in the digital world. So they are very, very concerned, and they are investing millions and millions in lobby pressure for this to be applied differently, but we're very good at that. And it's very good that Europe has got into this, because we are the only economic and social group worldwide that has dared to interfere between the two trends in the digital world, which is data are for the state, which is the Chinese approach, or data are for private companies, which is the American attitude or American approach. And Europe has said, no, we will regulate this. We cannot manipulate competition in the digital world. We cannot exploit citizens' data without citizens' consent, and we have to regulate things like how will AI evolve and the application of algorithms in all of our lives environment. Let me talk about two success cases which are also dependent on regulation. First, the success. The representative from the EU has mentioned it. The fact that all mobiles have to be charged with a single charger. This is fantastic. There's a black point, Apple. My opinion is that before adopting a joint common connector, Apple will say, well, now they will not be charged with this. And that's why we have 5 generations of mobiles without any cords, that can be charged without any cords. And then the second thing will affect you when you go on holiday. The suppression of roaming. The fact that you can move throughout Europe without worrying about whether you're paying for a supplement or not because you're calling from a country that's not yours. This is a great, great European success of the European Commission, and that needs to be recognized. And that's the road that Europe is following. If you want, we can talk about supercomputation later. Okay. When you talked about the number of large companies, there are more than 1,000 unicorns in the world, and only 100 are European. A unicorn is a company valued in more than 1 billion companies. 500 from the USA, 300 from China, and a bit more than 100 from Europe. That's the sort of picture we have. Yes. For example, in Europe... Sorry. Go ahead. Clément, what's your opinion about all of this? Clément, you have the floor.
Yes. Es un placer. Y antes que...
Thank you. It's a great pleasure. And before I go back to English, let me talk about the role played by Margaret Vestager. Margaret Vestager is Deputy President Executive of the European Commission at the same level as Thibaut Reil and Franz Timmermans, who are in charge of digital issues and also for all of the deliberations about the investigation which and research, which, as my colleague said beforehand, it represents the third budget of the multi-annual European Union multi-annual budget.
English. Just to mention that I am Clément. I'm working at the Directorate General for the European Parliament Research Service. And beforehand, I was working at the Commission in DG RTD, so the DG in charge of the programming implementation of the framework research program of the European Union, which means that I am more on the side of the investors rather than the regulator. But still, today I would like to drive you through the EU industrial and technological policies, and more specifically, I would like to discuss their role with regard to the twin digital and ecological transition. Why so? Because, as it was mentioned by the previous speakers, the twin digital and green transition represent the overarching political priorities set by the Commission led by President Ursula von der Leyen. But beyond this political importance, it is as well an economical importance, because up to 70% of the European economy, as measured in terms of added value, is based on ecosystems that are directly associated to those two transitions. It is my first answer to my presentation today. The second rationale, and I guess it makes sense, is that industrial policies are going through seawater changes, in the sense that the very notion of competitiveness is evolving, as we will see in a couple of moments. And in addition to that, we start in the EU ascribing new objectives to our industrial intervention, not least the question of resilience. And resilience, it ranges from being able as a society to procure masks or other medical countermeasures, such as vaccine, just to rein in a pandemic, but it goes as well in other directions, such as, for instance, ensuring that all the territories of the European Union are able to receive communication, just in the case, for instance, where there might be an emergency in terms of a climate crisis, a meteorological crisis, and we need to ensure the continuity of our socio-economical activities. So for this, I would suggest to split my presentation in two moments. First, I would like to explain the role of industrial and technological policies inside the EU, and then, based on a sample of relevant examples, I would like to outline a taxonomy of the new, I would say, the new generation of industrial policies. So let's start with the role of such policy into the realm of the European Union. In order to agree and to define this role, I will need first to turn back to the mandate, because I am a lawyer, and then I will present you the political approach that has been taken and developed by the Commission led by President von der Leyen. So, when it comes to the mandate, I would like to start by quoting two articles of the treaty, not because I am a lawyer, but because it is, from a methodological point of view, an important step to understand what kind of answer the EU can design. So, when it comes to the industrial policy, the important article is Article 173.1, which states that the Union shall support the competitiveness of the EU industry, not least by supporting its adjustment to structural change. And I guess that digitalization and ecological crisis are of such magnitude that they qualify easily as structural change. So this is the first block. The second block is related to the technological policy of the European Union. And here the relevant article might be, is Article 179.1, which, if you want, inaugurates the chapter of the treaty which deal with research, technology, and space. This article stipulates that the EU should, I quote, strengthen its scientific and technological basis for the sake of being able to disseminate knowledge as well as ensuring the circulation of creators across the EU, so that, at the end of the day, the competitiveness of the industry is ensured. From a legal point of view, we can see here that there is a commonality, the keyword of competitiveness. The distinction, and I will stress only one thing, is that when we talk about technology and we think about EU public policies on technology, we have to be very clear that they are not only targeted on applied research and innovation and market valorization. The EU is acting as well on basic science, and it is one important pillar of this framework program for research innovation that has been existing in the EU since 1984. And basically, it is indeed, from a budget point of view, associated with the so-called multi-annual financial framework. Just to give you an idea, the current program for research, Horizon Europe, is endowed with a budget of 95.5 billion euros. I think it makes sense to give you as well an outlook on what does that mean from a relative point of view. It means that the EU has a budget representing 10% only of the total public spending of research and innovation across the Union. And you will see that it will imply consequences on how we can set industrial initiatives. So here the mandate is set. Now, what is the political approach? And I want to discuss here about the keyword of competitiveness. And I would say that whilst classically competitiveness has been essentially defined as the increase of productivity and or associated with the growth of the output, since 2019, the Commission von der Leyen has taken a very significant step to extend this definition of competitiveness. You might have already heard about this concept, which is competitive sustainability. What is competitive sustainability? It is a definition of competitiveness that, together with productivity, integrates as well other considerations, namely three: environmental sustainability, fairness, also known as social justice, and macroeconomical stability, which means that the mandate is extended. Okay, and where can you find this definition of competitive sustainability? You can find this definition in the annual Sustainable Growth Report survey, which is an annual survey prepared by the Commission in order to inform the EU semester. The EU semester is the process where member states and the Union are coordinated their socio-economical policies. So here, what we have to keep in mind is an extended approach to competitiveness. Second, the need for coordination as well, because the resources at EU level are limited, 10%, for instance, when it comes to research in comparison with the budget available for member states. So the role of the EU when it comes to industry and technology to accelerate the transition is to provide directionality, which means to provide the incentives for the public and private investors across the EU to team up toward common goals and implement them. This is my transition to my second part, where I would like to offer you a very quick state of play of relevant initiatives along the green and digital transition, but I will as well touch on the need for resilience. So, in order to be quick but systematic, I have to admit that what I will present now is pretty much based on a very interesting report published in May by OECD on an industrial policy framework for the OECD country. OECD is offering us a very interesting taxonomy of the industrial policies. A taxonomy is a system whereby you associate objective with instruments. When it comes to the objective of the EU industrial policies, let's say that we can identify four main kind of interventions. We have the so-called mission-oriented initiative, where a public investor, together with stakeholders, define a public policy goal which is broad enough to accommodate different pathways, different implementation to arrive to the objective. And when it comes to the EU, most of the current mission-oriented initiatives are funded under the Framework Program for Research, Horizon, and they are pretty much linked or absolutely linked with the provision of public goods. Just to reconnect myself with question raised yesterday by one of the participants on the role of the EU when it comes to combating cancer, I would like to say that under Horizon Europe, we have currently 5 missions going on from now to 2030. One of those 5 missions title is Beating Cancer, Saving 3 million lives by 2030. So here you can see a clear, concrete example of a mission-oriented initiative with a public good objective that will be achieved mainly through collaborative transnational research. What does that mean, collaborative transnational research? It means that the EU, with its budget, will grant to a consortium of different actors, academics, industry, NGO, citizen, grants for them to implement different relevant bricks that at the end of the day will allow us as a society to have effectively spared 3 million lives. Another example of one of the missions of Horizon Europe is clearly the so-called 100 climate-neutral cities. So here the ambition is to help 100 cities across Europe, and a little bit beyond, by the way, to step up their efforts in order for them to be either climate-neutral by 2030, or at least to be in an attainable pathway to this. Just to sum up this mission-oriented thing in one sentence, the role of the EU here is to be the investor of first resort, just to make the comparison with the concept of economy. So again, the EU sets together with stakeholders in the co-design principle an objective. It provides money to start the journey, and then based on this public investment, the idea is to crowd in resources of different nature, intelligence of the researchers, medical availability when it comes to cancer, so we need to work with hospitals and private capitals as well. Okay, second very important concept of EU industrial policy, a technological push. And let's say that it is a false twin of this mission-oriented initiative. Here, instead of defining public goods as the final objective, the final objective is pretty much defined with a goal of technological nature. The best example we have discussed yesterday is this EU Chips Act, whereby the EU, noting that today its economy is able to produce only roughly 5 to 7% of the chips across the world, wants to step up its ambition so that by 2030 it will produce 20% of the world production. So here I would say that the approach is much more top-down, and when it comes to co-designing, obviously it is a little bit less intense in the sense that originally those technological push are pretty much based on dialogue with a set of existing industrial actors. In order to reconcile this approach with the competition rule of the EU, plus the need for fairness, and I would say as well, of equal opportunities across the territories, so EU is designing specific instruments to allow newcomers to step in. So for instance, when we talk about this CHIPS Act, one of the concrete deliverables of the investment will be the creation of what we call digital, test beds. What is a test bed? A test bed is an infrastructure funded with EU money, owned either by an industrial consortium of industrial or consortium of academics, and those persons are in charge of the person in charge of the infrastructure must accept to give accesses to their infrastructure to newcomers, especially SMEs, so that we can support new actors without the need for them to invest, for instance, heavily in the need to have their foundry to market their products. I will finish with two other kind of industrial policies that are of a more classical nature. The first one is the sectoral policy. So it is quite transparent, I would say. You, as a public institution, support a new market. Here, a good example in the recent initiative of the EU might be this European health data space, where the European Union wants to accelerate the production of e-health services and goods by European manufacturers. Last but not least, because it is important, especially for transition, the last kind of industrial policy initiative identified by OECD is the so-called place-based innovation, whereby instead of supporting either a public good, either technological push, you will rather support a certain kind of beneficiaries. The most straightforward example I can find is the so-called widening program of Horizon Europe. So what is widening? Widening is a specific program that grants specific funding to the territories that are less intense in science and innovation across the EU. So basically we are speaking about member states that joined the EU after 2004, plus the so-called outermost regions, included for Spain, Las Canarias. So here we dedicate specific funding just for the sake of facilitating the networking of the research and industrial ecosystem in those countries. Because in a certain sense, there is excellence everywhere in Europe, but we need to connect better the newcomers. Okay, I think that now I will conclude by trying to mitigate a shortcoming of my presentation. I have talked very much about investing, but I have not talked about the creativity of the persons that are working in those industries. And let me quote an important fact is that in order for our European political plans to work, we need not only to invest in new technologies, we need not only to put all the industrialists around the table, we have as well the need to prepare for the next generation skills. So a couple of figures. Across the OECD, the share of women that are currently following a PhD program, either in ICT, either in engineering, is clearly below 30%. So here we can see that we are losing a lot of creativity, which means that our industrial policy cannot be seen in isolation from other interventions such as education. And I think it is quite fair to quote the importance of gender balance in this discussion. Many thanks.
Thanks, Clement. We will be back to this topic since public and private collaboration is one of the key roles, I think, in the European ecosystem, and gender balance is a challenge as well, so we'll be back. Now, Carme, tens una estona.
And now, Carme, you have 10 minutes. Yeah, I'll be very brief, and then we can talk amongst ourselves, yeah. Well, just to wrap things up and not repeat myself, what I wanted is to tackle the geopolitical aspects of technology, and especially what this means for the European Union in the face of these transitions underway, because technology determines in many ways the new power dynamics right now, and the way in which we approach them, or how states and the European Unions approach technology, and the use that technology makes of states, which is clearly represented by these bipolar situation between techno-authoritarianism and the Silicon Valley model, which, I mean, ultimately they are both seeking data control for different reasons. And true, besides, technological platforms have become geopolitical actors. And I think we have a very clear example in the war in Ukraine. And what we are seeing over the months, since February, we've seen how the technological giants in the US, for instance, are private actors in the war in Ukraine, and how they have aligned with Western strategy in some cases, either through political pressure, for instance, with Apple suspending the sales of iPhones in Russia, or the capture and control of data as information, from mapping to censorship, clearly. And we have also seen how the awareness of tools or instruments such as Google Maps to be used for war, in this case, either through identification of troops, of civil population, military strategy, and how exactly, with this awareness, Google Maps disabled the application in this area of the country. We have seen how many of these great technological companies also aligned with the sanctions approved by the United States and by the European Union. Microsoft, Apple, Samsung, Oracle, Cisco, they have all refused to sell their services to Russia or have shut down their operations in this country. And also at the security level, Microsoft has been, for instance, providing information, internal information that they had on some hacking, some technological attacks they've had since the beginning of the war, let alone the very relevant role of Telegram, which is a Russian app, in the mobilization of citizens, or the support to Russian troops, but also when it comes to reporting to Ukrainians, and obviously TikTok, which is Chinese-owned, as the New Yorker already qualified the war in Ukraine as the first TikTok war. So all these technological platforms have a geopolitical dimension and are geopolitical actors right now, which is also exposing the European Union to new vulnerability, which is this lack, because Albert was very rightfully so talking about these giants, but I only have one slide and that's it. But I think it's very revealing as to the global challenge when it comes to upholding these technological giants. Here are the big global platforms sorted by continent, the weight of the platforms in America, in Asia and in Europe and Africa. And if we compare them, we can see how digital spaces are clearly prey to this bipolarity that I was talking about in the beginning. So the battles over digital space occupy today a central part in the fight for global power to position oneself globally. And the European Union doesn't want to be left behind in this confrontation. The problem is it wants to do so through developing a model of its own, which Albert was starting to point out in that direction, and I completely agree. This regulatory model, Europe as a normative power, and how it tries to deploy an approach of its own to technology. There's a philosopher, well, an expert in IT ethics called Lorena Jaume Palazzi, who does research in Berlin, and I quote her very frequently because she's the one that has studied the most this approach to us that we as societies have to technology. And she says we digitalize from what we are, from the way that we see the world. And with this approach, the European Union is trying to have an approach of its own, of its way of regulating itself and of seeing the world, approaching technology beyond this reality. Albert has offered lots of figures, and so has Clement, and the US and China represent 65% of every patent having to do with blockchain technology, just these two. 50% of global expenditure on the Internet of Things, which is a world that Albert knows a lot more about than me. They joined 75% of the cloud market and up to 90% of the capitalization market of the 70 largest platform companies in the world, as we can see here according to UNO data, whereas the European Union only has 3.6%. Technology is a projection environment. It's a power environment, but it's also a way to project the world vision, interests, priorities, as well as the conception of security, of human rights, as well as commercial interests. And lately, at CEDOP, we have been working a lot on the whole matter of cyber threats and how this digital space is also a space of confrontation. And we realized how, when all is said and done, this approach to technology also determines your own approach or your own vulnerabilities when it comes to security, of cybersecurity or digital, if you allow me to put it this way. You are confronting countries whose approach to technology comes from the military or security environment, whereas the regulation in the European Union has always been geared at protecting consumers. So we are fighting in entirely different arenas with entirely different visions of technology, and that's part and parcel of who we are and of the results that we are getting. But it is true that we are seeing a configuration of new scenes or new influence spaces, new influence spheres technology-wise, and clearly we have seen how many countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, Africa, Indo-Pacific environment, as well as Central and Eastern Europe, as well as the Balkan region, are more and more under the influence, for instance, of Chinese technology, detrimental to others. And in these power spheres, the European Union is getting left behind. And we're talking about the Silk Route in China. And there's a digital Silk Road, which is underway in China and which will have consequences for the European Union. And no matter how much they try to play in the big league and trying to develop this sort of medium model between China and the US, any model needs allies. And the technological reality of the European Union is closer to that of India, Japan, or South Korea than the US or China. And that when it comes to strategies, it's something to be taken into account, because a digital strategy needs instruments and it needs infrastructure. And I think that Clement already explained in great detail how this deployment is being carried out, the strategic frame, the digital compass, which was approved in March 2021, which identifies the main action lines and also the synergies between civil and defense industries. And then you need infrastructures. And many have been already mentioned this morning in this session and the previous one, the European law for on chips, Clement was talking about just a minute ago, the deployment of 5G corridors. There's a project called Gaia X, which was born like a French-German initiative, and now the European Union has appropriated it with European funds to connect small and medium cloud providers to have common standards. Not just to create a huge European cloud, but a very sort of European Union vision to connect and create standards with the existing cloud companies to gain muscle. And there's been an initiative that started last year of underwater cable to connect the European Union to Latin America and build new networks. So there is an infrastructure and there is a strategic framework, but what we have above all is an approach and a model, which is where I wanted to put the accent, which is this notion of a regulatory power. The European Union, as a champion of a certain governance or of a specific governance framework that is different to what has been ruling the great two technological powers on a global stage. And here's where we've seen more progress lately. There's not just been progress, there's been an acceleration, a normative acceleration, unprecedented in the past few years. If we think about the Great Directive, which is considered a model in this governance model, such as the Data Protection Directive, which became really a reference for those who wanted to regulate data protection worldwide, or beyond the European Union at least. And this is a directive that took 6 years between the moment it was proposed, when it was negotiated, it was approved and implemented. If we think about the law for digital services and markets, the interinstitutional PACOs that it has had has been 1 year. And really what it manifests is this feeling of, the sense of urgency in this acceleration, in this regulatory acceleration, and the need, the will to create a framework from Brussels, which is often called, what the academics call the Brussels effect. And that's the extraterritorial impact of legislation approved within the European Union. The GDPR is the greatest example. And I personally think that the law for digital services could have this Brussels effect impact, such as the GDPR had, in the sense that no matter how much the European Union might be trying to compete in a different league, it ends up having its own influence in this league. Oftentimes, and I'm quoting a column published in Politico in Brussels on this normative approach from the European Union to technology. And the article was called "Arbiters Do Not Win Matches." The referee does not win matches, because that's a very American vision, that you cannot be a leader in regulation if you are not a leader in innovation. But those are two different views of technology. And true, referees may not win matches, but if there's no rules, there might be abject cheating during the match. And that's where the European model has a role in this technological competition, and where we believe we are seeing progress in a much faster and more effective way. Because if there is something that has been achieved in this technological approach and the relation with big technological platforms over the past few years, the European Union, what we have seen is that it ended up modifying the very concept of themselves that these technological platforms had. Before the Code of Best Practices on misinformation, the large platforms were acting like highways through which content would circulate without them having no legal or civil liability on the quality of the content that was shared. And this has all slowly changed, and it has been modified pretty much by European demand. And now the Digital Service Act is a step forward in that sense. And that's where I really wanted to highlight about the European model, which is trying to, carve a way for itself, and just to tie in and just wrap things up and then start the debate amongst ourselves with what Clement was saying and what you were pointing at, Albert, is a little bit, how do we join this industrial need this need for leadership or for a geopolitical role with internal challenges, and not just economic but also social. And this is where the fair transition comes in, that this digital transition, which has a whole aspect social, that is social and political, because if there's something that we've learned in the European Union over the past few years, is that the a population that feels deserted or that feels disconnected from all these changes that are taking over its reality, it ends up having clear consequences in the polls. How do we guarantee that the transition is fair? And the figures, and I'm just going to mention 3 to be quick. Europe has the highest percentage of people that use the internet, 82.6%. But there are countries in the European Union, Bulgaria, Greece, Italy, Romania, where nearly 1/4 of the population never accesses the internet. So there are internal digital gaps that are significant. 36% of the population in Central and Eastern Europe isn't connected to the internet, as opposed to 36% in Western Europe. And as what you were saying, Mark, women represent 65% of the European workforce, of employees, people that hold a job in Europe, but only 17% in the new technology sector. So we are developing this technology with a significant gender bias. And it wouldn't be fair to hold this internal approach, which is also dependent on competition and fair societies that we need to uphold in the European Union. Thank you, Karma. I think we're all in agreement, because our 3 panelists, I think, are in agreement in their diagnosis, in identifying what the strengths and the weaknesses are of what we have. And together with the article that you mentioned, we mentioned how Europe is centered on this model, that regulation has a very heavy role. But my question is, do we want to remain regulators, or do we aspire to be players? And can we play if we don't have the industry that we are lacking? So I go beyond wishful thinking. What do we need to happen? Are we doomed to be forever the regulators of the world? Will we do this from the top through regulation, or will we be creating companies, or do we need to do that by creating companies that set standards? And above all, are we too late to react and change? If I may, I would say I think that the role of the referee is very important, and I'm really proud that the European Union took it on, because I insist. The Yanks are terrified of this. But I also have to say that the attitude in Europe, despite the acceleration that Carmen mentioned over the past few years, has been more reactive than proactive. There are 2 instances that have recently popped up between COVID and the war in Ukraine that I think are quite symptomatic. The first one is, I think you may have heard about it, about the scarcity of chips. And the other one is the scarcity of batteries to make mobility electric. Cars and buses and trains, all electric. Well, the European Union has an investment program to create chip factory, the CHIPS Act and whatnot. But as it happens, every important project for making chips both advanced and not as advanced needs participation from a technological partner, whether American or Asian. So it's like, well, Intel, in one of the factories that they create, where they were trying to start a factory in Ohio with funding from the American government, but they're also waiting for funds from the European Union to start a factory in Germany, as well as other projects. Like there's one in Spain of 9,000 million euro, where they're also waiting for a tech partner that will not be European. And then there's the battery issue. There's also an investment program in Europe with about making batteries in Europe, but their chips are also dependent on external technological partners, because the basic technology was not developed, and that's on the European companies. because we have two European battery brands that are very important. One is the German Varta, it's a very important company, and the other one is the French Saft, which are more on the industrial battery field. And these two companies, until, they did not see the need for batteries, and you say they could have woken up sooner, couldn't they? And there's another aspect where I think, I don't think we're putting all the necessary emphasis, which is this supercomputation. And supercomputation is very important here in Barcelona. You're probably familiar with Mare Nostrum 4, hosted at UPC University, which is the most powerful supercomputer in Spain. It's devoted to medical research and climate research. And they're already building Mare Nostrum 5, which will be built by Atos, a French company. They were awarded the contract recently. And it will have quite an impressive power. I think it's 200 megaflops, which is a measure for calculus power, which is very good. And it will be part of a European network, and I think that's the important thing in the case of the European Union, called EuroACPC, which is a supercomputation European network which will have nodes in Barcelona, Finland, Italy. So they will build a network of European supercomputers made available to researchers, and one of the things they will be doing, which is quite interesting, they will design chips for supercomputation, European chips. But part of this work will be carried out in Barcelona with Mare Nostrum 5, with participation from 300 researchers paid for by Intel, which is an American chip company. So there are some of these significant economical relations, and I'm going to say one last thing. Competition, so to speak, it isn't dead in its tracks. While we're still building the supercomputer Mare Nostrum 5 in Barcelona, these MOOCs that will be starting, best case scenario, next year, the US and China have already set in motion supercomputers which are 5 times more powerful than this one. So by the time Mare Nostrum comes into power, Europe will still be lagging behind. And I don't know if this is, something to criticize or not, but this is just something to keep in mind.
Try to be brief. I might start. I might start with the question of high-power computer indeed, because back in the time when I was working in France, I contributed to the discussion at council level of the regulations that establish this joint undertaking. And by the way, I'm very happy that Mare Nostrum has been chosen, and I guess it is a nice example to show that with a single initiative, the EU is able to be both proactive and reactive. On this example, the EU is reactive to the fact that indeed, from the beginning of the 2000s, more and more researchers were going abroad to use computer power for their works, especially in medicine. And as everybody can understand, going abroad with data needed to make medicine or life sciences experiments raise other questions than simply the question of scientific leadership. We have here a democratic issue of protection of our privacy. So with the ambition to put EU machine among the top 10 supercomputers by 2030, I guess, at exascale level, which means concretely that the computer will be able to perform in 1 second 10 puissance, I don't know how we say, 10 exponents, 18 operation at second. We are just setting an objective of global leadership. But there is an intermediate step in this project, and it corresponds to indeed the network of computers that we are procuring now with EU money, just for the sake of, on one hand, reducing immediately the dependence of abroad equipment, but as well it will give us the ability to develop, I would say, associated skills needed to maximize and optimize the use of such equipment, because behind the construction of computers you have other indeed elements, such as how to make applications work for those, but as well how to design the very shape of the computer. So I guess that indeed we can balance our objective and be proactive and reactive in the same time, at least in this technological field. Then, when it comes to the dilemma between regulation and innovation, here I'm afraid that it is our generational dilemma, and we cannot afford to avoid it. Here I would like to quote a very important philosophical book of the 20th century by a German author whose name was Hans Jonas, who wrote in 1976 a really important book, which is The Principal Responsibility, Das Prinzip Verantwortung, I think in German, whereby very simply said that our society has come to the point where the human being acting, the action of human beings clearly outpace our capacity to reflect on our action, which means that we need to be cautious with any new elements, because we very much know that what we are creating can go far beyond what we can immediately conceive. So it is a message to say that indeed we have to incorporate the risk associated to our action, but the good news is that it comports as well benefits. I will take the example of this synergy action plan between the defense and space industries. In one word, let's say that this exercise is based first on a common discussion between the actors of the space sector together with the actor of defense and security. And the outcome of their dialogue is a taxonomy that probably will enable us to provide services without major gaps. So by taking this additional time of discussion, of design at the beginning of a new innovation initiative, probably we maximize our effectiveness at medium term. And maybe I had a last thing on batteries, but no, I think I will give you the floor.
No, molt breu sobre innovació.
I'll just be very brief on innovation and regulation. I think it shouldn't be a dilemma. We ought to aspire to have both. We simply know that right now we are better at regulating than at innovating, but we need to aspire to both. May I just give some nuance? Are we better regulating than innovating? I don't know. I know we're good at regulating, we are good at innovating, but we are bad at industrializing innovation. Yes, I like that. That's the other part of the title of this session, Industry and Technology. But we also need to be aware of the limitations when it comes to global governance, because we keep talking about the digital world, about the internet, like it's a be-all-end-all, and for a while the internet has become very fragmented. Now the English talk about splinternet. So we find ourselves in front of two entirely opposing visions and a completely contradictory development of this whole digital space. So we're running out of time. I don't know if we can, if we have time for questions from the audience. Maybe we could get them all together. Yes, please, just ask a few questions at once and we will try to answer them, because I'm sure... Hi, good morning. My question is for Mr. Clement. So I will be speaking in Spanish if you will be so kind. I fully agree that in Europe we have 3 million of people with cancer, and each year we get 3 million more, out of which 1,300,000 die each year. So I just wanted to ask you a small question. We have a spending account with people who have cancer, or at least it's not well thought or it's not well innovating, not just in Spain, which I know, but at the European level, which is how to bring back these people who have cancer to their jobs. Statistically, in the first year after having cancer, 60% of people who have had cancer go back to work and are still alive. In the second year, up to 80% of living cancer survivors go back to work. A good European innovation program would be, how do we orient, how do we outline in a way that is truthful and human the return of these cancer survivors to work? Because cancer will only get bigger. Thank you. We will be answering at the end of that. We will take all the questions at once. Hello, can you hear me? Thank you. My name is Paula, and first of all, I wanted to thank you for all your words. And actually, I have something I want to point out, because I was really interested to hear everything you had to say, because they've been all different, but at the same time, they were interconnected. So we started talking about the past, about Europe, as, how we got it started in industry. So we were giants in the past, which means that we could be in the future. And, just something to point out in that respect. And then as to, for what Karma was saying, you mentioned how we could have innovation, speaking from a vision of our world. But I found it really surprising that both China and the US are starting, industry-wise from the most Latin American aspect, when their vision is really very similar to that in Europe. And I just wanted to point out that I think that's quite curious. Is there a way in which Europe can bring our vision of evolution, both when it comes to climate change and when it comes to gender? Because we've been talking about this, and I think in Europe, it's just a thought more than a question, but is it possible to reach new innovation by showing our vision of the world, our European vision of the world when it comes to climate change, for instance, which is a great problem? But when it comes to climate change, there's a solution, but it's still a long way off. And I mean, maybe one vision could be to talk mid and long term, and I don't know if there's a way to connect that. I hope that was understandable. We're taking notes if there's any other question. My question is for Albert. Of the examples that you gave in the beginning, I counted them, there's 17. None of them was from Southern Europe. And my question is, are we bad at innovating in Southern Europe? Do we not innovate? Are we lacking this industrialization of innovation that we were talking about? And how can we improve that? Because it's true that in Europe, we have a disadvantage towards the United States concerning Northern Europe. As you showed, there is a huge industrial tradition with companies that are 2 centuries old. So is it possible that we will not be getting any unicorns or any powerful startups? And you mentioned startup was born in Estonia, which is a country with less than 2 million people, and here in Mediterranean people, which is about half the population in the European Union, and yet we have not a single example of a company that comes close to the success of this technological giant. So what can we do in Southern Europe to better industrialize our innovation and to innovate more?
For Clément, I wanted to ask, because you mentioned that only 10% of the funds for research and development in the European Union come from the European Union itself and not come from member states. I wanted to ask your opinion on the very mediatical action of Emmanuel Macron with the Startup Nation and trying to make France the leader of startups. And that has happened in many politicians in the European Union. They want to make their country the leading innovative country in Europe, and they have kind of that vision of doing nationally the best, right? So I wanted to ask, what is, if you think that strategy of, for example, nation startup of France is good for Europe, or if actually trying to compete with European countries in such a level is actually could be negative for a more, for the whole of the European Union. Yeah.
Puc fer una pregunta? Vale.
I have a very short question. My name is Marty. Thank you all for your presentation. The only doubt I have is that we have talked a lot about a comparison between Europe, the USA, and Asia. And bearing in mind that our industry fits our culture, how can we compete with the States or with Asia, bearing in mind that these are questions in which labor laws are not taken into account, labor rights, and in the States where they have a different mindset in terms of labor legislation, and because they do not have a welfare state that actually imply the costs that a worker implies in Europe. And so, I mean, maybe we're bad at reindustrializing because we're much costlier from the point of view of hiring a worker. Okay, could you actually turn off the air conditioning because we're really cold here? Very quickly. With regards to the regulation that was mentioned, with the new law about the GDPR, for example, i.e. the control of cookies for third parties, there are many other alternative choices like Google Sandbox or Fingerpin or digital identities. But now they doubt as to whether they can be applied and implemented in Europe because they're not strictly like third-party cookies, and there is no regulation that looks at whether they can be implemented somehow. How does Europe have a mechanism to flexibilize these laws and to allow that these alternatives are introduced, which are demanded by some European companies to be able to innovate as well? Could you repeat your question, please? Could you repeat it? No, you
about that here in the EU, like the regulation for the third-party cookies, it's quite strong. You need like explicit consent from the people in order to use those cookies. But now they're like coming to light new alternatives, for example, in the US or other countries, like for example using Google Sandbox, the digital fingerprints, etc. And there's no like regulation that tries to understand if we can implement these alternatives here in Europe, because they are not the same as third-party cookies, but as we are not sure if they can have the same problems, we are scared of that, and we are not like letting these new technologies come here in order like to help the enterprises in terms of innovation, for example. So is there any way that, for example, the EU can flexibilize like the regulation in order to adapt these new technologies that are coming?
This means being less European, maybe.
Yeah.
So maybe you could start.
With a question on cancer, just to mention very briefly that the missions of Horizon Europe, and especially the mission on beating cancer, is an holistic, follows an holistic approach, whereby in addition to producing research on the causes of the disease, and by the way, here Europe is very important because it gives to the researcher the pool of data they need. Indeed, we will as well tackle the socio-economical, I would say, aspect of the disease, and namely, it concerns as well the reincorporation of persons who are turning back from an acute and intensive care session. But here, we have as well to be conscious of the fact that we are living in a complex political, legal system where member states retain competencies when it comes to labor law and security law. So indeed, probably different action will be performed in order to inform on the best practices, to facilitate, but at the end of the day, it will be up to the member states to take or not the advice that will come there. Okay, and then I noted, maybe it's in the disorder, sorry, the question on Latin America, and I would label it as the question of the European Union soft power. Two elements to answer, and I don't start with Latin America, I start with the IPCC. Just to mention quite brutally that without the European Union, I'm not sure that the IPCC would have the fresh money to operate and allows its networks of researchers to write down the reports, as simple as that. Then, turning back to Latin America, an important legal element of the program Erasmus, but as well of the program Horizon Europe, is our capacity to associate third countries, whereby in exchange of an international agreement, the legal entities of these countries will be recognized more or less the same rights of the legal entities established in the European Union, which means that the universities, their industry will be welcome to operate with us Europeans, and it is more than theoretical, it is already the case, and if you want, not less than 10% of Horizon Europe budget is flowing towards partners across the world. Currently, as things stand, we have already 16 countries associated to Horizon Europe. Most of them are in our neighborhood, but we are starting for the first time discussion with Canada, New Zealand, South Korea and Japan. Yeah, you might notice that we don't have any plan as of now. At least I'm not aware of any plans to consider associating any of the Latin America countries. But there is a high-level policy dialogue on science between the CELAC community and the EU. So CELAC stands for Central America, Caribbean and Southern America, where on a biannual basis there are meetings between EU officials, member state officials and Latin America official, and we try very concretely to coordinate our research innovation agenda. So this would be my answer regarding Latin America.
And then the one asking your opinion on Macron's strategy.
Yeah. On this, I will. I think it is always important, as the economist John Maynard Keynes was writing, that it is important for us to be conscious that what we think to be new ideas, they are often ideas that have been offered by economists that passed away 30 years before we were born. And on this, I will mention a person that, luckily enough, is not passed away because he's now the mayor of Lisboa. I'm talking about Carlos Moedas, who is the former commissioner for research innovation under the commission Jean-Claude Juncker, and he was at the origin of the need to radically increase our capacity to provide private investment to our innovative companies. But I wouldn't say that President Macron has invented something on its own. I think that he has managed quite well on this to connect itself with other like-minded persons across Europe, and it is important as well for our quality of policy making. Startup nation, and then very technical question on the cookies. Here I'm afraid that I might be too much a conservative lawyer, and I consider that as soon as we have a regulation that forbids certain elements, our duty as public official, at least I am a public official, is just to enforce the law and avoid to opening loopholes to things that put our state of law at risk. I know it's not a fully convincing answer, but this is my approach to it. I don't know if we had another question. Okay.
Carme i Albert, si voleu...
Jo volia contestar la Paula.
I wanted to answer Paula. Right, that's the one I wanted to answer, yes. Because I'm a bit more skeptical, to be honest, than Clément. For example, with regards to Latin America, which is the topic I know best, for a number of years, I have been giving diplomatic training in Latin America with regards to disinformation above all. There was a lot of interest to know what did the EU do? Why is there a lack of references of their approach to the large technological companies? And the practice code I mentioned was used as a point of reference to more than one government in Latin America. Argentina signed this type of a code, very similar with the large technological platforms. In Uruguay, there was also a lot of interest. In Chile, too. I mean, it has been followed. And there was this need. And I believe that the EU did not know how to take advantage of this. It did not know how to have a strategy. Because whilst this was happening, there were also some significant economic needs. There was the trade entry, an incredible trade entry from China to South America. They bought companies and they have gained a lot of political influence. And I believe that we only need to see how things have changed, especially in the southern part of Latin America. The balance between who are the large investors, the large trade partners of Latin America in the last few years, and how China has imposed itself. We only need to see the map of vaccinations after the pandemic, how the whole of Latin America either has the first Russian vaccination or the Chinese one. So from that point of view, it is the EU, with its own internal problems with Mercosur, the ones that have not had these necessary soft power to keep on being a partner that I believe Latin America wanted and needs. So let's change questions. Albert, there was a specific question for you. Well, I hate to say this, but I believe that the south of Europe, I mean, we are just really bad. I mean, let them invent new things. That's a sentence that came to my mind whilst he was talking. But let me give you two recent examples. Then let them invent things. A number of years ago, 90% of the data in the world go through submarine cables, which actually, at the beginning of the pandemic, it was said that things were affected by COVID. No. Anyway, I mean, connectivity. The internet, the underwater internet connection is very important for a country. It's important to have cables. And Catalonia is in a very good strategic position for different reasons. A number of years ago, there was a cable that crosses the Mediterranean through Alexandria that reaches Marseille. And it was relatively simple. There was a project from some Catalonian businessmen to have it, to get it from the south of, to fish it from the south of, from the bottom of the sea, to cut it and to take that connectivity directly to the Barcelonian coast. And they suggested it, but it didn't come to good port because businessmen here who had the money to pay that, they decided they preferred to keep on investing on the construction industry. The local capital, and I'm talking about the Catalonian capital, I'm not talking about Spain, they decided that they preferred to invest in the building industry and not in the country's connectivity. Now, this very same capital, local capital, is very fearful, and that allows me to talk about the second example. These startups, this startup environment has a significant problem here. I mean, when it comes to scaling up, they do not grow. Why do they not grow? Because people who should invest money on them, they are fearful and they do not invest the needed money to turn them into one of these beautiful balls in commerce graph at a worldwide scale. And there are very interesting things that happen. Companies that have a big growth potential, I'm talking about video games and many others, they end up being bought out or invested by non-EU companies, for example, a video game startup a few weeks ago, it was almost purchased. They did not want to say at which percentage. They acquired, by a 10. One of the companies, I'm talking about Motorama. Novorama is a Barcelona company that they do the Invisiman. It's a character. So at the end, they are very good. And the Chinese realized they were very good. And what did they do? They bought a majority stake in the company. So what's happening? What concerns me is not that these companies are good and that outside of the EU there is capital invested to buy them. What worries me is that the means, the authorities, and the entrepreneurial environment here, they present it as a success, i.e. that non-EU capital comes in to acquire most of the startups here. To me, it's a total failure, because what does that mean? That means that these company, these workers, the founders of the company become wealthy. They become filthy rich immediately, and workers start getting paid more. But the profits generated by the company, they are not generated in Barcelona anymore, and they are generated in Shanghai or in Palo Alto. And what concerns me is that the fact that we are so happy that a non-EU company, that a major or a deep tech from the USA or from Asia comes in to buy Catalonian startups. I think that's a total failure for our European ecosystem. Well, we are running very late. Would anyone like to?
Who is going to answer? Well, I have another example, a specific example on this that has to do directly with workers' rights. The only place in the world where there is one more sustainable mobile producer, sustainable both when it comes to the use of blood minerals as well as fair work conditions for its employees, is a Dutch company called Fairphone. And they make phones that are guaranteed of, we have bought this amount of percentage of fair materials, as fair as possible, and we also make sure that our Asian contractors are also paying minimum wage. Well, do you know how many fair phones are sold around the world? 1,300, 1,350,000 million Fairphones were smartphones were sold around the world. How many Fairphones? 13,000. So we could be betting on that, but we're not. Well, at the beginning, the European Union Commissioner said he would lead with a sad story, and he's slowly been fixing it. So we coincided on a diagnosis, but Albert's final words made it really easy for me to close things up with a note of optimism. I agree that we have a serious problem when it comes that we don't have bigger companies in Europe. But I think we have more than we know. And we need people from abroad to come and tell us, because that's only then that we'll believe it, because we said the case of Fractus at the beginning. But we are starting to have companies that have been highly significant. And it's true that video games have finished selling, but as they have sold historically, most Catalan industrial companies, and let's not forget that the Industrial Revolution started in England, but then it continued in Catalonia and in northern Italy. And Italians were great at creating industrial giants in all sectors, but not only industrial giants were able to create the most extant restaurant in the world, which are pizza places, and we have bread with tomato, which uses basically the same ingredient, and beyond the river Ever, no one knows how to make it. But beyond that, we just weep and weep that you don't have an industry. And suddenly, 5 years ago, Barcelona appears in every European rank as the third favorite country in the world and in Europe to create startups. And I remember back then I was working as a journalist, and when I came to the paper with that news, I was like, what have they been smoking to set up? No one has been smoking anything. This is the work of many years. There's an industry, there's great research. It's really difficult to apply it, to turn it into companies. And I could just start name dropping, like what Albert did in the beginning with old brands, and I could do that with new brands. I don't know if you knew Travel Perk, for instance. I'm sure you all know Booking. Well, that's a company created in Barcelona 2 years ago. 2 foreigners, that's true, but they're Barcelonians by choice. They decided to create a company here called Travel Perk, which is just a platform just like Booking for work travel. And they have 500 employees, and they could be anywhere in the world, because they really don't advertise they're being based in Barcelona, but it's a global player, and they're set to become global leaders. And just like this, we have many other examples, as well as companies based here that are creating technologies that could be game changers on the global stage. They're just missing that step of being able to grow and become big. And I don't think the matter of resources, it's not that there's no local money. Because yes, everyone likes the big investment, but money right now is global, and Barcelona is on the map, just as they are on the great investment groups. And just to wrap things up, because we've been going around in circles, but there's been a work that has been popping up, again, beyond the European model that we're building. There's a word that's missing, which is ambition. Because frequently, when it comes to being big, to be large, let them invent, you said. When Mobile arrived in Barcelona in 2016, one of the first Catalan companies to export or to be showing at Mobile, the entrepreneur said, the technology we're explaining here is just as good as that of many of the other companies, but no one believes it. And just I met a startup the other day, one last anecdote. For Nokia, more than 10 years ago, they created a facial recognition system. That was a company based here in Barcelona. And Nokia said, no, that's never going to work. 4 days later, Apple starts their facial ID system, and it becomes a world standard. And this is a little bit what's happening to us. We don't have that ambition for a development that we were able to do. Why can't we turn it into a world standard? And I don't know if it's just a matter of generational maturity or ecosystem maturity. And when it comes to globalization, maybe we will finally be able to incorporate the skills or the ambition to believe that what goes on not just in Barcelona, but in Europe as a whole. And here I will, just to be regulators or just to be arbiters, why can't we set our own rules and come out to play? Thank you very much, everyone, for being here.